The land stretched wide and empty, a silence too vast for words. The cowboy rode with shoulders hunched, hat brim shadowing a face carved by sun and years, his horse moving in a weary gait that mirrored the man astride it. The day's heat had bled away, leaving the air brittle with dusk. Far to the west the sun sank low, burning the desert in deep tones of ember and rust, until the whole horizon looked like it had been set aflame and left to smolder. He had no destination, only the stubborn instinct to keep moving, as though the earth itself might swallow him if he dared to stop too long. Loneliness had ridden with him longer than memory, whispering in the wind at night, pressing against him like the weight of an old scar. His rifle lay across the saddle horn, his only companion besides the horse. It was then he heard the sound, high, sharp cries cutting across the quiet. At first he thought it was the call of some desert bird, but it came again, breaking into the low growl of beasts. His horse stiffened, ears pricked forward. The cowboy pulled the reins, listening, children's voices shrill with terror. Wolves. He spurred forward, hooves pounding across the hard earth, and came upon a dry riverbed carved deep into the land. Down in the hollow, two girls, no more than 7 or 8, stood pressed together against a fallen log. Their dark hair was tangled with dust, their faces streaked with fear. Circling them, wolves slunk low, their eyes catching the last scraps of light, teeth bared in a hunger sharpened by winter. The cowboy swung down before thought could intervene, his rifle raised in one motion. A crack split the air, echoing off the barren cliffs. The nearest wolf dropped, twisting in the dust. The others froze, snarling. Another shot rang out, a third. The pack broke, scattering into the twilight, their howls fading into distance until only silence remained again. The girls clung to one another, their cries swallowed into hiccuping breaths. He lowered the rifle slowly, smoke curling from its barrel, then stepped nearer, hands raised, not to frighten them more than they already were. His voice was quiet, low as a prayer. You're safe now. But the words meant little. Their wide eyes held no trust, only confusion. They did not understand his tongue, and he did not understand theirs. Still he knelt, motioning gently. After a long pause, one of them reached out a trembling hand, and he let her clutch the rough sleeve of his coat. He led them back across the scrubland, his horse trailing behind, the sun dying into indigo night. Their small footsteps padded alongside his boots, and though they made no sound, he felt the weight of their fear pressing close. By the time the lights of a homestead flickered in the distance, lantern glow against the dark, the air had turned sharp with cold. Smoke lifted in thin streams from a low-roofed cabin, carrying with it the bitter tang of cedar and sage. The girls broke from him, rushing ahead, their voices suddenly alive again with a word he did not know. From the doorway emerged a woman. Her shawl, woven dark with patterns like earth and shadow, hung tight around her shoulders. Long braids framed a face still young, though worn by grief etched deep at the corners of her eyes. She caught her daughters in her arms, kneeling as they buried their faces in her shawl. Relief lit her gaze for the briefest moment, before it shifted upward to the stranger who had brought them back. The cowboy stopped at a respectful distance. He stood as one accustomed to rejection, body angled as though ready to turn away at the first sign of hostility. His rifle hung loose at his side, but his stance spoke of a man who had seen suspicion before and carried it like another scar. The woman did not thank him. Her eyes burned, not with kindness but with guarded fire. She rose slowly, the shawl slipping as she placed her children behind her. Her voice, though low, carried the firmness of stone. He could not make out the words, yet the meaning was plain. Stay away. The cowboy lowered his head slightly, a gesture of respect, though he knew it might not be enough. He looked at the girls, then back at their mother, his breath clouded in the cold night air. I mean no harm, he said, though the words felt hollow in the face of her mistrust. For a moment, silence stretched long between them. The desert seemed to pause, the wind itself waiting. He thought of turning then, mounting his horse and vanishing back into the vast emptiness. It would be easier. He had spent his life leaving, and the habit clung to him like dust to boots. But something held him there, the sight of those children's small hands clinging to the shawl, the raw defiance in the widow's stance, her shadowed eyes meeting his as though daring him to prove himself different from every man who had taken or abandoned. Finally, she motioned with her hand, sharp and decisive, go, and so he did, He turned away. Walking back into the dark, the sound of his boots swallowed quickly by the land. Behind him, the girls' voices rose again, thinner now, fading into the hush of the prairie night. He mounted his horse and rode slow, the lantern light of the homestead shrinking until it was nothing but a flicker against the endless black. The cowboy knew then what the silence had told him all along. Even good deeds could not unmake the shape of a man's solitude. Rejection was an old companion, and though tonight's wound was fresh, it bled into the same hollow place where all the others lived. Yet somewhere deep beneath the ache, a strange ember flickered, faint but alive. For in her eyes mistrust had burned, yes, but also something else. Recognition. The cowboy did not ride on. Something in the silence of that homestead, in the wary eyes of the widow and her daughters, had taken root inside him, though he would not have been able to name it. He kept to the edges of their land, never venturing close enough to intrude, never so far that he was out of sight. Each night he built a fire from whatever dead branches the wind surrendered, its glow little more than an ember's whisper against the prairie dark. The flames licked low, shadows clung high, and he lay with his back to the earth, staring at stars that felt colder than the frost forming on his blanket. The widow allowed him to remain, though no words passed between them. Perhaps it was gratitude left unspoken. Perhaps it was the knowledge that wolves were not the only predators that roamed the frontier. Still, her silence spoke louder than hospitality. He was tolerated, not welcomed. By day, he kept his hands busy. The fence along the southern stretch of her land sagged where wind and snow had pressed too long, so he gathered fallen posts, drove them back into the frozen ground, and tied them straight with worn rope. Tools left rusting in the shed he oiled until their edges gleamed. He sharpened the old scythe, fixed the head of a hammer, patched holes in a bucket with strips of tin. These tasks he did quietly, leaving them where he found them, asking for nothing in return. With each stroke of the whetstone, with each swing of the hammer, ghosts rose unbidden. He saw the face of his wife, once soft as candlelight, later hard as stone, when she told him there was no place for him under her roof. He saw comrades from the war, men with laughter too loud for the battlefield, now lying beneath unmarked soil, their blood long dried into the earth. He saw the child he had once hoped to cradle, never born, leaving only the echo of what might have been. Every night those shadows sat with him beside the fire, silent but heavy. He did not speak to them, but he felt their breath in the cold wind. The widow, too, carried her shadows. Sometimes from a distance he glimpsed her standing at the doorway with her shawl drawn tight, eyes fixed toward the hills. Somewhere beyond those ridges her husband had vanished, gone to fight for his people, never to return. His absence had left more than a widow's grief. It had left the cruel fracture of a tribe torn between the weight of promises and the sharp edge of betrayal. Treaties broken, kin scattered, dignity wrestled from their hands. Her strength was quiet, but it was born of survival. The cowboy knew that kind of strength, though his wore a different face. The land itself mirrored the weight between them. Winter gathered slow and sure. Wind pushed across empty fields, rattling dry stalks like bones. Snow dusted the fences he had mended, clinging to each knot of rope. Icicles hung from the cabin's eaves, dripping slow and steady, a heartbeat of water against the frozen silence. The children grew used to his presence before their mother did. At first they hid behind door frames, peering at him with wide, cautious eyes as he worked. Then one day boldness overcame them. A small braid swung loose as one of the girls stepped into the cold, holding a broken doll missing an arm. She placed it quietly on the ground near where he was mending a tool and darted back inside. That evening, after the fire had burned down to coals, the cowboy carved an arm from scrap wood. He smoothed it with his knife until it fit into the doll's shoulder. At dawn he left it by the threshold of the cabin. No words, no knock. When the girl found it, her small gasp carried more weight than thanks ever could, the widow noticed. Her gaze lingered a fraction longer when she passed him in the yard, though her face remained unreadable. Trust did not come quickly to a heart bruised by loss. He understood. His own trust had long ago been stripped from him like bark from a tree. At night, lying beside the fading warmth of his campfire, he thought of the life inside that cabin. The crackle of firewood on the hearth, the rhythm of a rocking chair as the widow soothed her children, the faint scent of cedar smoke and sage. These were sounds and scents that belonged to others, never to him. And yet, Knowing they existed so near made his solitude sharper, more jagged. For her part, the widow lay awake as well. She listened to the faint crack of his distant fire through the thin walls, the steady rhythm of his axe as it split wood for no one but her. Shadows of her husband pressed in, asking why she allowed the stranger to linger. She had no answer she could speak aloud. What she did know was this. When the wolves had closed around her daughters, it had not been kin or neighbor who saved them. It had been this man, scarred and silent, carrying a loneliness that echoed her own. Still, no words passed. The land waited with them, patient as stone. Snow deepened along the fences he had mended, yet the posts stood straight as though defying winter itself. The rocking chair by the hearth creaked beneath her weight, though its joints no longer splintered since his hands had touched it. These small things, like whispers left in the dark, began to stitch the edges of grief into something quieter. Though not yet whole, their griefs remained parallel lines, never crossing, never touching, yet moving in the same direction. And though neither dared to say it, both began to sense a truth that hovered like frost on the air. Sorrow recognized sorrow, even in silence. The storm came without warning. Morning had dawned pale and brittle, the horizon dusted with frost. By midday, clouds rolled over the plains like dark cattle driven by some unseen hand, their bellies swollen with snow. The wind quickened, sharp as broken glass. By nightfall, the land was swallowed whole, white flurries whipping across the fields until the fences he had mended vanished, until even the sound of his horse seemed to dissolve into the roar. The cowboy had seen storms before, on mountains where snow cut the lungs, on battlefields where smoke and ash choked the sky. But this one bit deeper, more merciless. His fire sputtered useless against the gale, sparks torn away before they lived a breath. His coat, patched and thinned by years of hard use, could not keep the cold from seeping into his bones. Fingers stiffened, numb even on the rifle stock. The world narrowed to the grind of wind and the ache of his own body. At the edge of collapse, he saw the faint glow of the widow's cabin, flickering like a star barely visible through the storm's fury. He pressed on, stumbling through snow that reached his knees. When he reached the porch, the wind screamed around him like the voices of the lost. He did not knock. He had no strength left to. The door opened anyway. She stood there, shawl drawn close, lantern light spilling across the threshold. For a heartbeat, she hesitated, eyes hard, torn between mistrust and mercy. Then she moved aside. He stepped inside. The warmth struck him first, not heat, but the promise of it. The air smelled of cedar smoke and old wool, the faint bitterness of coffee simmering low in a dented tin pot. The house creaked under the storm's assault, rafters groaning as though some great weight pressed down upon them. Firelight from the hearth wavered, painting the walls in restless shadow. The children huddled together on a blanket near the hearth, their braids undone, hair tumbling over their shoulders. They watched him with eyes wide as the night outside, torn between fear and curiosity. Their mother's shawl swept as she crossed the room, motioning him toward a chair near the fire. He obeyed without a word, sinking into it with the heaviness of a man too weary to stand much longer. The heat licked slow into his frozen fingers. He stretched them toward the flames, scarred hands trembling as life returned in sharp stings. The widow busied herself with the pot on the stove, pouring coffee into a chipped cup. She set it on the table before him without ceremony. He wrapped both hands around it, drinking deep. The bitterness filled his mouth, anchoring him back to the present. Silence thickened between them. Only the storm spoke, battering the walls with a fury that made the cabin shudder. Outside, snow piled against the windows, sealing them in. Inside, the fire cracked and spat, throwing their faces into half-shadow. The cowboy's eyes followed her hands as she worked, hands that moved steady, practiced, though he saw the tremor hidden beneath. He noticed the way she watched him as well, gaze falling often on his scars, the pale seam that crossed his knuckles, the old burn at his wrist, the uneven skin along his jaw where war had left its mark. She studied his hands when he reached for wood, when he stoked the fire, when he whittled a piece of kindling into shavings just to keep them busy. The children crept closer, drawn by the smell of warmth clinging to him, the sound of his knife against wood. One leaned against her sister, whispering in a tongue he could not understand. Their eyes never left him. Still no one spoke. The hours dragged slow, marked by the drip of melting ice against the eaves, the rattle of shutters straining against the wind. The cowboy felt the closeness pressing in, a weight both suffocating and strangely welcome. He had spent years beneath open skies, loneliness his only shelter. Now the walls held him tight, and though mistrust hung heavy, he felt the faintest stirrings of belonging, fragile as a candle flame in the storm. He glanced toward the rifle propped in the corner of the cabin. Its presence reminded him of the unspoken boundary that lay between them. He was still an outsider, a man with no claim here. One wrong word, one wrong look, and he could be cast out again, this time into snow that would swallow him whole. The widow sat at the rocking chair, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the flames. The chair creaked with each slow sway, a rhythm that steadied the children's breathing until they grew drowsy. He watched her, not with desire but with a kind of reverence. She seemed carved from the same wood as the chair, worn yet unyielding, bearing the weight of her grief without breaking. When the youngest girl finally drifted to sleep, head nestled against her mother's lap, the widow's hand moved to smooth her hair. For the first time since he had met her, the cowboy saw something soft in her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but tenderness. It was a glimpse into the heart of the woman behind the shawl, a woman who had lost much and still gave what little she had left. The storm raged through the night, howling as though it meant to tear the cabin from its foundation. Yet inside, the fire burned steady, the air thick with cedar smoke, the smell of coffee lingering. The cowboy sat in silence, listening to the storm batter against the walls, and felt, strange though it was, that he was no longer entirely alone. The storm did not pass quickly. It lingered, pressing days into one another, the wind a constant moan against the shutters. The snow deepened until the land itself seemed swallowed in silence, and with it, the lines of trust and suspicion blurred like tracks beneath drifts. The cowboy stayed beneath the widow's roof, though not by invitation spoken aloud. Necessity alone had cracked the door for him, and now necessity held it open still. Yet even as he stoked her fire and split her wood, his presence unsettled more than it soothed. Neighbors came, both settlers from the east and Apache kin from nearby camps. They brought word of raids and supplies short, of cattle driven thin by the cold, but their words stalled when they saw him there, sitting near her hearth or carrying buckets from the well. Their eyes sharpened, some with anger, some with unease. They left quickly, whispers trailing behind them like smoke. Old prejudices lived long, even in storms. To the settlers, an Apache widow's home was no place for a white man, no matter the circumstance. To her people, a cowboy was a reminder of all that had been taken, of treaties broken and blood spilled. Between both worlds she stood, and in her standing, she bore the weight of their judgment. Inside, silence cut sharper than the cold. The widow moved with a quiet that seemed almost deliberate, her shawl wrapped firm around her shoulders, her eyes lowered whenever his gaze lingered too long. Yet she carried something heavy within. At night, when the children had gone to sleep, she sometimes sat by the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Inside, wrapped in linen yellowed with years, lay her wedding dress. She had not touched it since the day she folded it away after her husband's death. Still, she could not bring herself to part with it. Her fingers would rest on the chest's lid, tracing the carvings without opening it, as though even the thought of its fabric might betray the man she had loved and lost. The cowboy did not know of the chest, but he saw other things. He saw the thinness of her children's coats, patched so many times the cloth was more repair than original weave. He saw the way their stomachs tightened with hunger, though they said nothing, and so he hunted. At dawn he would take his rifle and vanish into the snow-laden woods. By dusk he returned with rabbits, sometimes a deer, once a brace of grouse. He left them quietly by the door, never announcing the gift, never stepping inside with them. In the mornings they were gone, taken in, cooked, shared. The children's cheeks grew rounder again, their steps quicker across the floorboards. Still, his presence unsettled the widow. Each kindness he gave felt like a debt she could not repay, a debt that leaned dangerously close to betrayal of her late husband's memory. She carried guilt like a second shawl, wrapped close, suffocating yet impossible to cast aside. For the cowboy, every glance at her was a reminder of rejection past. The tilt of her head, the guarded way she held herself, the shawl draped across her shoulders like armor, these reopened wounds that had never truly healed. He remembered the wife who had turned her back, who had told him he was too broken, too distant to remain. In the widow's silence he heard echoes of those words. Yet in her silence, too, he felt something else stirring, faint but undeniable. One evening, the rocking chair creaked beneath her weight as she sat near the fire. It had been splintered before, joints weakened from years of use, but he had repaired it, smoothing the wood, tightening the nails until it moved again with steady rhythm. She rocked slowly, shawl gathered around her, the firelight casting her profile in soft relief. He sat across from her, whittling wood, the knife's rasp the only sound between them. Her eyes fell to the chair, to the way it no longer groaned as it once had. She remembered her husband sitting there, rocking with a child on his lap, singing in a voice rough but gentle. A pang of guilt struck deep. To sit in it now, mended by another man's hands, felt like a betrayal. Yet she did not rise. The cowboy saw her stillness, her gaze lingering on the chair, and he knew what she remembered. He said nothing. His knife moved against the wood, shaping nothing, shaping everything. The storm pressed harder against the roof, rattling the shutters, whistling through the cracks like the cries of restless spirits. The children curled on their blankets, braids undone, breathing deep in sleep. The widow sat wrapped in her shawl, eyes fixed on the fire, while the cowboy whittled with a patience that carried years of silence. Their attraction was not the heat of sudden fire, but the slow gathering of sparks hidden beneath ash. Neither named it. Neither allowed it breath. Yet it pulsed there, between the creak of the rocking chair and the steady scrape of the knife, between her guarded silence and his haunted gaze. It was a quiet storm, no less fierce for its restraint. And though both bore loyalty to ghosts, both felt the weight of the present pressing closer, asking silently what life they might yet claim if they dared. Word of the fire spread faster than the smoke ever could. By morning, men rode out, settlers in thick coats, faces set with suspicion, and Apache kin who came with eyes sharp as flint. They found the barn still smoldering, its ribs black against the pale sky, and they found him there too. The cowboy, rifle resting at his knee, ash clinging to his coat like a second skin. Murmurs rose. Some spoke of raiders, others whispered of betrayal, their glances darting between the widow and the stranger at her side. To the settlers, a cowboy who fought for an Apache widow was a man turned against his own. To her people, his presence at all was an insult, a shadow across old wounds not yet healed. The widow stood at the threshold, her children pressed close, the shawl wrapped firm around her shoulders. Her face was calm, though her heart hammered beneath her ribs. She had endured silence long enough. Now, dignity demanded speech. She stepped forward, her boots crunching over snow laced with ash. Her voice carried not in volume but in weight. She told of the raiders who had come in the night, of fire set to destroy not only wood but memory. She told of how the cowboy had stood with rifle in hand, risking his life when no kin, no neighbor, no settler had been there. Her words were plain, without ornament, yet they fell heavier than any bullet. The settlers shifted, unease in their stares. The Apache who had come to question her bowed their heads in silence. Between both sides, her voice had cut through suspicion like a blade through cloth. The cowboy listened, saying nothing. He was a man used to silence, to the weight of others' judgment, to walking away before the tide could turn against him. But when she spoke his name, clear, unshaken as the one who defended her home, something inside him stilled. For the first time in years, he felt no need to run. The gathering dispersed, uneasy but quiet. The whispers faded, carried off by wind. The smoldering barn stood as scar and testament, but the home remained. And in that home, for the first time, he was not unwelcome. That evening, he saddled his horse as he always had before. Habit pressed hard. The road was familiar. Leave before bonds grew heavy, ride before trust turned thin. His fingers traced the worn leather of the reins, every motion whispering departure. Then he looked back. Through the cabin window, firelight glowed steady. Inside, the widow sat in the rocking chair, her children at her feet, shawl spread across her shoulders. The chair creaked slow, steady as a heartbeat. And in the flicker of the flames, he saw something that stilled him more than any storm ever had. Home. Not the one he had lost, nor the one he once dreamed of, but the one that stood here, fragile, scarred, alive. He let the reins slip from his hands. The horse shifted, exhaling steam into the cold. The cowboy reached instead for the door. Inside, the air smelled of cedar smoke and coffee. The children looked up at him, their eyes no longer wide with fear but softened with trust. The widow lifted her gaze, steady, unafraid. She did not speak, nor did he. Words were unnecessary. He crossed the room and sat across from her. The fire cracked, throwing warmth against faces long accustomed to the cold. After a pause, she drew the shawl from her shoulders and laid it across both of them. His scarred hands rested upon the fabric, her fingers brushing close, unhurried. Certain, the rocking chair creaked again, not under her weight alone, but under theirs together. Outside, the prairie wind still howled, sweeping across the open land with the voice of loneliness. But within the walls of the cabin, the sound softened, held back by firelight, by presence, by choice. For once, he did not ride away. The cowboy had carried rejection like a brand across his life, each departure carved deeper into him, but now scars no longer told the whole of his story. Here, with the widow beside him and her children near the hearth, he found a truth stronger than the silence he had borne for so long. Belonging was not granted. It was chosen, and he chose to remain. The fire burned steady through the night, shadows swaying across the walls like old ghosts finally laid to rest. Dawn would come pale and cold. The barn would still stand in ruin, and the whispers of neighbors would not vanish overnight. But the rocking chair held to again, the shawl-bound warmth where once there had been only distance, and the old wounds no longer bled as they had before. It was not passion, not miracle, only survival turned to something gentler, a second chance at dignity, a slow healing. The cowboy leaned back, listening to the steady creak of wood, the soft breath of children asleep, the faint rustle of her shawl. For the first time, the silence that filled him was not hollow but whole, and outside the wind moved on. It began with smoke, not the thin, steady smoke of a winter hearth, but the sharp, acrid sting of burning timber. The cowboy woke first, instincts older than rest snapping him upright on his cot near the door. Outside, the night glowed faint red against the snow, flickering like some infernal dawn. He snatched his rifle and pushed through the door. The barn stood wreathed in flames, boards snapping, sparks spitting into the wind. Snow around it hissed as embers fell, each one a reminder that fire cared little for boundaries. Shadows moved in the glow, men, not wolves, slipping between the light and dark. Settlers, raiders, those who saw profit in fear, who preyed on the widow's isolation, believing no one would defend her land, but someone did. The cowboy leveled his rifle. The first shot cracked across the night, sending one figure tumbling into the snow. The others scattered, their shapes lunging through firelight. Another shot rang, then another. The stillness of winter shattered, replaced by the echo of gunfire rolling across the hills. The widow had rushed to the doorway, shawl clutched tight around her children. Her eyes fixed on the man outside, moving in silence and shadow, his form outlined by flame. He fought not like one who sought glory, but like one who sought survival, for himself, for them, for a dignity that could not be bought or begged. The barn moaned, its timbers collapsing inward. Sparks leapt skyward, scattering against the dark like stars torn loose. Snow turned black beneath the falling ash. The cowboy reloaded with steady hands, even as bullets whined past, striking fence posts, biting into the frozen ground. He returned fire, each shot measured, each step sure. One raider lunged close, knife glinting in the firelight. The cowboy swung his rifle hard, the butt striking bone with a crack that split the night as sharply as any gunshot. The man dropped, groaning into silence. Then it was over. The barn blazed, its roof caved in, but the attackers had fled, their shouts fading into the blackness beyond the fire's reach. Smoke rose heavy, rolling low over the ground, drifting like ghosts across the snow. The cowboy stood still, chest heaving, rifle loose in his grip. Firelight flickered against his face, carving the hollows of his scars, painting him in both ruin and strength. He turned slowly, eyes catching the widow's. For a long moment neither moved. Only the fire spoke, crackling and sighing as it consumed what once had held tools, hay, and memory. The children pressed closer to their mother, but her gaze did not leave his. When at last she stepped forward, it was not toward the barn, but toward him. The shawl slipped from her shoulders, and with careful hands she lifted it, draping it across his back. It carried the faint scent of smoke and sage, of cedar and wool, of her. He froze, unused to such tenderness. His breath clouded the air between them. Slowly he reached for the edge of the fabric, his hand brushing against hers. The touch was brief, light as falling ash, but it lingered longer than any words might have. Their eyes held. Not passion, not the reckless heat of desire, but something deeper, slower. It was the thaw of ice beneath spring sun, the first trickle of water after months of silence. She did not thank him, and he did not ask for thanks. The gesture spoke enough. The dawn crept pale behind the smoke. Ash drifted across the snow, settling in gray patches that would remain long after the fire had gone cold. The barn was lost, but the home remained, the children safe within. And in that moment, the widow saw him not as an outsider, not as a shadow to be tolerated, but as a man who had risked all he had, not for reward, but for her dignity. The cowboy felt it too. For years he had lived beneath the weight of rejection, carrying it like a brand no water could wash away. But now, standing there with her shawl across his shoulders and her eyes lingering upon him, he felt something he had nearly forgotten. The quiet possibility of belonging. Neither spoke as the fire died low, leaving only smoke and embers. Words were fragile things, too small to hold what had passed between them. Instead, they stood in silence, the storm within them softer now, the storm outside finally breaking into calm. The children peered from the doorway, watching their mother's hand linger near his as though caught by some invisible tether. They did not understand the weight of it, but they felt its warmth. The sun rose, pale and uncertain, its light filtered through smoke. Ash clung to their boots, to the shawl across his shoulders, to the blackened snow around them. Yet beneath the ruins, something fragile had survived. Not passion, not promise, something slower. A seed buried deep beneath the frost, waiting for spring.